There were cities in the medieval world where the streets never truly slept. Long before the sound of factories or engines, stone avenues echoed with iron wheels, market cries, church bells, and the restless movement of thousands of lives compressed behind defensive walls. At sunrise, smoke climbed slowly from bakeries and blacksmith shops, while merchants unfolded fabrics imported from distant ports few citizens would ever see. To outsiders, these cities appeared eternal. Massive cathedrals dominated the skyline like monuments to divine permanence, and rulers believed the walls surrounding them could resist both invasion and time itself. But beneath the rhythm of daily trade and prayer, something fragile had already begun to spread through the foundations of urban life. The collapse did not begin with fire or conquest. It began quietly, hidden inside overcrowded alleys, poisoned rivers, exhausted farmland, and systems so dependent on stability that even a small disruption could trigger consequences no one fully understood. And by the time the first signs became impossible to ignore, the medieval city had already started to decay from within. In many parts of Europe, medieval cities expanded faster than their infrastructure could sustain them. Narrow streets designed for small populations suddenly carried thousands of residents, animals, carts, waste, and commerce simultaneously. Houses rose upward in unstable layers of wood and stone, often leaning over the streets so closely that neighbors could shake hands through opposite windows. Beneath this dense urban growth, sanitation barely existed. Human waste was dumped into open gutters that flowed through crowded roads before eventually reaching rivers used for drinking water. The smell became a permanent feature of urban life, mixing with smoke, sweat, wet straw, dead animals, and industrial residue from workshops operating inside residential districts. Yet most citizens considered this normal. Medieval people adapted to discomfort because survival itself demanded adaptation, but no one understood how vulnerable these cities had become. The more prosperous urban centers appeared on the surface, the more dependent they became on fragile trade routes, seasonal harvests, political stability, and uninterrupted labor. Every crowded market square concealed a system already operating at its limit. Life inside these cities followed strict rhythms, shaped by class, religion, and survival. At dawn, peasants entered through the gates carrying vegetables, grain, meat, or firewood from surrounding villages. Artisans opened their workshops while apprentices swept floors and prepared tools before sunrise. Wealthy merchants negotiated contracts in stone buildings protected by armed guards, while beggars waited outside churches hoping for scraps of bread or charity coins distributed in the name of salvation. The city was not simply a place to live. It was an organism built on constant movement. Bakers depended on grain arriving from distant fields. Blacksmiths relied on charcoal shipments. Markets relied on caravans crossing dangerous roads, vulnerable to weather, raids, and war. Even water itself depended on systems easily contaminated by overcrowding and neglect. But despite these growing pressures, medieval cities continued to attract migrants seeking opportunity. Rural populations flooded urban centers during periods of prosperity, believing the city represented safety and advancement. Few realized that the same walls promising protection could also trap disease, hunger, and panic once the balance holding urban life together finally began to fail. The warning signs emerged slowly enough to be ignored. Food prices fluctuated more violently after poor harvests, caused by colder seasons and exhausted soil. Wells became contaminated more frequently as population density increased beyond what local resources could support. Fires spread rapidly through districts packed with wooden structures built almost on top of each other. Crime intensified in overcrowded neighborhoods, where poverty expanded faster than authorities could control it. Yet rulers and religious leaders often interpreted these disruptions as temporary hardships rather than symptoms of systemic decline. The medieval city depended heavily on confidence. Citizens needed to believe the markets would reopen tomorrow, that food caravans would continue arriving, that the church still maintained divine order over society. But confidence weakens long before institutions visibly collapse. Small fears began shaping daily decisions. Merchants stored supplies instead of selling them. Families avoided unfamiliar districts after sunset. Travelers carried stories of abandoned villages, failed harvests, and unexplained sickness, moving slowly across trade routes. The decay did not announce itself dramatically. It spread through whispers, hesitation, shortages, and the growing sense that the systems protecting urban life were no longer reliable. Then came the epidemics. Few events accelerated urban decay more violently than disease outbreaks, moving through medieval cities, already weakened by overcrowding and poor sanitation. The most devastating example emerged in the 14th century, when the Black Death entered Europe through expanding trade networks, connecting ports, markets, and caravan routes across continents. Ships arrived carrying more than spices and silk. Hidden within cargo holds were rats and fleas infected with a plague capable of destroying entire communities within weeks. In crowded cities, infection spread with terrifying speed. Streets once filled with commerce became silent except for funeral bells and wagon wheels, carrying bodies to mass graves outside city walls. Physicians possessed almost no understanding of contagion, and desperate citizens turned towards superstition, prayer, violence, or isolation. The collapse did not begin with visible chaos. It began when routine disappeared. Markets closed, workshops emptied, priests stopped visiting homes, families abandoned relatives to avoid infection, and as death spread through every social class, the illusion of urban permanence shattered before millions of terrified witnesses. The psychological impact of epidemic collapse transformed medieval cities permanently. Fear altered human behavior more effectively than any military invasion. Neighbors avoided eye contact in public squares. Travelers were treated as threats rather than guests. Entire districts became associated with sickness, poverty, or divine punishment. In some cities, authorities attempted quarantines by sealing gates or restricting movement, but enforcement remained inconsistent and often too late. Meanwhile, labor shortages destabilized the economy itself. Farms lacked workers to harvest crops, creating food shortages inside cities already weakened by panic. Skilled craftsmen disappeared faster than replacements could be trained. Construction projects stopped mid-progress, leaving unfinished cathedrals and abandoned fortifications as silent monuments to interrupted ambition. But perhaps the deepest rupture emerged in the collapse of trust. Citizens no longer believed their rulers, physicians, or religious institutions could protect them. By the time the signs became fully clear, medieval urban society was no longer simply experiencing hardship. It was entering a prolonged period of fragmentation, where survival increasingly depended on isolation, mobility, and personal adaptation rather than collective stability. War intensified everything already breaking apart beneath medieval urban life. Cities across Europe frequently became battlegrounds during dynastic conflicts, territorial disputes, and religious struggles that lasted for generations. Armies consumed enormous quantities of food, wood, metal, and labor, draining surrounding regions before even reaching city walls. When sieges began, urban populations found themselves trapped inside overcrowded fortifications with limited supplies and growing desperation. Wells became contaminated, grain reserves disappeared, disease spread faster among civilians, weakened by starvation and fear. Sometimes the city survived the attack, only to emerge economically devastated afterward. Other times, invading forces burned districts deliberately to destroy resistance or punish rebellion. Even victory carried consequences. Defending armies demanded taxes, labor, and materials that exhausted already struggling populations. The collapse of medieval cities was rarely caused by one catastrophe alone. Instead, epidemics, warfare, famine, and political instability reinforced each other continuously. A city weakened by plague became vulnerable to economic failure. Economic decline weakened military defense. War disrupted trade. Trade disruption created hunger, and hunger prepared the population for even greater waves of disease and unrest. Climate instability quietly deepened the crisis during the later medieval centuries. Historians now refer to part of this period as the Little Ice Age, a gradual cooling trend that altered harvest cycles, increased rainfall, shortened growing seasons, and intensified food insecurity across large regions. Medieval societies depended heavily on predictable agricultural rhythms, and even minor disruptions could produce devastating consequences inside urban centers. Grain shortages caused bread prices to explode beyond what ordinary laborers could afford. Malnutrition weakened immune systems already exposed to recurring disease outbreaks. Rural communities abandoned exhausted farmland and migrated towards cities searching for survival, only to increase overcrowding further. Rivers flooded more frequently, damaging bridges, mills, and roads essential for trade and communication. But few medieval citizens understood the broader environmental changes surrounding them. To many, the disasters appeared random or supernatural. Religious processions filled streets as populations searched desperately for explanations. Yet no prayer could restore the balance urban society had already lost. The medieval city had become dependent on systems too interconnected and fragile to survive repeated environmental shocks without severe and lasting decline. As instability intensified, social divisions became impossible to ignore. Wealthy elites often isolated themselves inside fortified estates or less crowded districts, while the poor remained exposed to hunger, violence, and disease in deteriorating neighborhoods. Resentment grew rapidly. Urban riots erupted over food shortages, taxation, corruption, and political abuse. In some cities, angry crowds attacked merchants accused of hoarding supplies or manipulating prices during famine. Elsewhere, minority communities became scapegoats during epidemics and economic collapse, facing persecution fueled by fear and desperation. The social contract binding medieval urban life together slowly disintegrated. Citizens no longer trusted institutions to distribute resources fairly or maintain order consistently. Crime expanded through districts where authorities had effectively lost control. Gangs, mercenaries, and private militias increasingly shaped everyday security more than official governments. The decay of medieval cities was not only physical, it was psychological and moral. Once collective trust disappears, infrastructure alone cannot preserve civilization. Stone walls may still stand, markets may still reopen, churches may still ring their bells, but the invisible structure holding society together begins collapsing long before the buildings themselves finally crumble. Many cities entered cycles of abandonment that lasted generations. Entire neighborhoods emptied after repeated epidemics or economic decline made maintenance impossible. Roads deteriorated, aqueducts collapsed, public wells dried or became polluted beyond use. In some regions, forests reclaimed former farmland surrounding urban centers as populations declined dramatically. Travelers describe streets overtaken by weeds, houses without roofs, and marketplaces reduced to silence. Yet medieval urban decay rarely unfolded as a single apocalyptic event. More often it resembled exhaustion, a gradual inability to repair what once functioned. Governments delayed maintenance because tax revenues disappeared. Merchants avoided unstable regions. Skilled workers migrated elsewhere, searching for opportunity and security. The city continued existing physically, while slowly losing the systems that had once made it prosperous. But no one living through the process fully understood they were witnessing the end of an era. People adapted day by day, crisis by crisis, hoping stability would eventually return. And that uncertainty became one of the defining characteristics of collapse itself. Most civilizations do not recognize their own decline while it is happening. They experience it as an endless sequence of temporary emergencies. Yet, from the ruins of decay, new forms of urban life eventually emerged. The collapse of medieval systems forced societies to rethink trade, governance, sanitation, labor, and architecture in ways that would later shape the modern world. Population decline altered economic relationships permanently, increasing the value of labor and weakening rigid feudal structures in many regions. Cities slowly rebuilt with broader streets, improved defensive planning, and more centralized political authority. Maritime trade expanded as kingdoms searched for new wealth and stability beyond unstable local economies. But the memory of collapse remained embedded in collective consciousness. Medieval citizens had witnessed how quickly certainty could disappear once infrastructure, trust, and environmental balance began failing simultaneously. Their experience exposed a reality civilizations repeatedly ignored during periods of prosperity. Complexity creates vulnerability. The more interconnected a society becomes, the more fragile it can grow beneath the surface. And even centuries later, the abandoned districts, plague cemeteries, and ruined fortifications scattered across Europe still preserve silent evidence of what happens when urban systems exceed their capacity to survive pressure. The medieval city was never destroyed by a single enemy. No army alone could have produced such widespread decay across continents and generations. Instead, collapse emerged from accumulation. Overcrowding, disease, climate instability, Political fragmentation, economic dependence, and fear slowly reinforced one another until urban systems lost the ability to recover between crises. That is what made the process so terrifying for those who lived through it. The danger rarely appeared sudden. Most citizens continued working, trading, praying, and planning for the future, even as the structures supporting their world quietly weakened around them. The collapse did not begin with chaos, it began with normalization. People adapted to worsening conditions step by step, until instability itself became ordinary, and by the time the consequences became undeniable, the transformation was already irreversible. Medieval urban decay remains one of history's clearest reminders that civilizations rarely disappear in a single dramatic moment. They erode gradually through pressures ignored for too long, while daily life continues moving forward as if permanence were guaranteed. Today, the ruins of medieval cities still stand across Europe and beyond, attracting visitors who walk through restored streets, illuminated by modern lights, often unaware of the suffering once hidden beneath those stones. Cathedrals that survived plague, famine, riots, and siege now appear timeless, almost immune to history itself. But beneath their foundations lies the memory of overcrowded alleys, filled with fear, silence, hunger, and uncertainty. The medieval world believed walls, faith, commerce, and power could preserve urban civilization indefinitely. Instead, it discovered that cities are living systems, dependent on fragile balances between environment, trust, labor, infrastructure, and human cooperation. Once those balances collapse, recovery may take centuries, and perhaps the most haunting aspect of medieval urban decay is how familiar its patterns still feel. Because every civilization eventually reaches the moment when warning signs become visible, institutions begin struggling to respond, and ordinary people continue their routines while something essential quietly starts to break beneath the surface of everyday life.